Hey folks, it's Marvin Cash, the host of The Butcher Shop, where the meat meets the water. On this episode, I'm joined by Captain Ben Whalley for a deep dive into Bob Popovics' Beast Fleye. We discuss the history of the fly, its versatility in fresh and salt water, as well as how to tie it and fish it. I think you're really going to enjoy this one. But before we get to the interview, just a couple of housekeeping items. To make sure you don't miss a single episode of The Butcher Shop, be sure to subscribe in the podcatcher of your choice. We're only distributing episodes on the articulate fly for a limited time. And if you like the podcast, please tell a friend and subscribe and leave us a rating and review in the podcatcher of your choice. It really helps us out. And finally, a shout out to our sponsor, Trout Routes. We all know streams are getting crowded, and chances are you're not the only one at your local access point. Get away from the crowds and busy gravel lots by using Trout Routes Pro with over 350,000 access points mapped across 50,000 trout streams, and much more. Trout Routes has all the data you need to help you find angling opportunities that others will overlook. Up your game and download the app today. Use code ARTFLY20, ARTFLY20, all one word, for 20% off of your Trout Routes Pro membership at maps.troutroutes.com. And a shout out to our friends at Schultz Outfitters. Schultz Outfitters is Southern Michigan's premier fly and tackle shop, and the guys at Schultz Outfitters are some of the fishiest dudes on the planet. Book a day on the water, swing by the shop, or check out one of their many classes taught by some of the best anglers and tyers in the game today. Check them out at schultzoutfitters.com or give them a shout at 734-544-1761. Now, on to our interview. Well, Ben, welcome to the Butcher Shop.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to our conversation tonight. And folks, like we do on the series, we always pick a fly, and we're going to talk about the beast. But before we get to that, we were talking before we started recording, but, we've had kind of a funky weather spring. How's your striper season going?
The season's off to a good start now. We've been about a week and a half behind schedule with a nor'easter hitting us out of the gate as fish were arriving. So pretty much New Hampshire, Maine, Massachusetts, everybody's pretty much a week behind schedule. But there's lots of fish on the flats. Today was another awesome day. Great viz. Some nice bass to the boat. So no complaints with days like today.
Very, very neat. Yeah, you were up early. I think you texted me at 5:15 this morning.
Yeah, I get up at 3:15 every day.
Wow.
Yeah. The grind. Love it.
Yeah. So, you are one of the keepers of the flame of Bob Popovics' flies and all of his tying methods. And I was really curious before we start talking about the Beast Fleye, how did you meet Bob?
So it's funny. I met him later in his life. And it was kind of happenstance, being up in Maine. I'm not like down the road from him or really in the scene, I guess. And I purposely kind of stayed on the outskirts because I've tied since I was little. But I tie for myself and tie to do my own thing and, figure my own fishing out. But back in 2019, I think, winter of 2019, someone I was chatting with on Instagram, Ian Devlin, was up for the holidays and asked if he could swing by my house and hang out. So my wife was a little doubtful of that decision, but I obliged, and we hung out, tied some flies, and I didn't realize, but when he left, he ended up going down and sharing with Bob one of the flies I had given him. And it was the next day I got a call from Bob pretty much out of the blue. And we kind of hit it off then, and then COVID hit, and he had his restaurant in New Jersey, and every Monday his restaurant was closed. So I didn't realize the importance of it, but every Monday night after dinner, we'd start texting or calling, and he'd share, articles and videos and just, answering all my naive or, and kind of educating me on the history of all this stuff. And it kind of grew from there. I'm very much a type of person where I think history is very important to the sport and just in general. And, you know, just being able to sit back and listen and learn from someone that's put so much effort and time and passion. And um so we were very similar and hit it off. And boy, super grateful I got the little bit of time to really get to know him, and got to get down and tie in his tying room and a handful of times. And he just very generous, and missed that guy big time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so when you were sharing information, was it kind of, kind of Zooms and phone calls, or were you sending flies back and forth? I mean, is it a little mix of old school and new school, or kind of how did you do that?
Yeah. So definitely some flies back and forth. He sent me um a couple beasts that I have mounted in my office now. Um and I'd send him some, and then, text messages. He was big on text messages, and he'd accidentally FaceTime me all the time while he's like driving to work, and which he always got a kick out of, because he thought he was, you know, putting me out, or, just a random butt dial. And I was like, ecstatic to get to chat with him on his way to work. So, but and then DVDs, like he had burnt DVDs of like a ton of videos he did. So he sent those to me. And, so kind of a blend of all of the above. I think a lot of the greats want to pass it on. It's one of those things where you just have to be open and willing to listen, and I try to embody that in all the classes I teach. And it's like, you know, giving your knowledge freely to people willing to listen isn't taking away from your greatness. And I think when you're young, you might think that, but I think it's what makes them great, wholeheartedly. Like, I think it's that kind of selfless passing it on, carrying the torch, that is why our sport is so great.
Yeah, it's super neat. Like, I didn't know Bob well, but I could watch him on social media, and you would see him supporting all of these younger tires.
Yep.
Right. And, I can't, I just always remember he would be like, "Hey, this looks great. Look at this fly by this guy," which I thought was super cool.
Yep. Yeah. I think there are very few people in our industry that have had the impact that he had, and more so than like a pattern, or even 50 patterns, however many he came out with. The revolutionary idea, and Blaine's another one, in my opinion, kind of charting that path too, is like coming out with these platforms. He's like, sure, here are the patterns, this is how you can tie them, but this is like, take it and do with it, whatever you want in your fishery. These aren't like hard fast rules. Take it, build upon it, and keep pushing the envelope. And I think that's neat, because it's easy to kind of get caught in that, like, that's not tied how the originator tied it, and it's like, his intent was for his fishery. And he kind of got to the point, I remember him telling me, where all of the baits in his fishery that he wanted to mimic, he had come up with patterns. So at that point, he's like, I'm satisfied with the imitations for those given situations, right? Which was kind of when he switched more towards helping others, I think, because he was satisfied kind of with his quest to dial in his fishery.
Very, very neat. Do you know where the name for the Beast Fleye came from?
I do, yeah. So the first, like, Beast Fleye, Bob had been out with his buddy Lance in Barnegat Bay, and there was a bunch of horse mackerel or horse bunker, sorry, horse bunker, like monster ones and he was throwing like an extended body hollow fly. So like the tail was tied on a piece of mono extension to get the length. And they didn't connect with any fish, but like the biggest pattern he had just was so tiny in comparison. And there's a lot more to like the hollow fly and kind of how that came to be that we can discuss. But as far as the name goes, so he ended up going home and like figured out this extended body and the hollow and literally made this fly that was 14 inches by 6 inches by 2.5 inches, right? Absolute tank, right? Dense head, sparser tail. And he went out, I think on Island Beach State Park with Johnny King, and Johnny King coined it the Beast because it was a beast in size and a beast to cast, and it stuck. Johnny still has that fly.
Very, very neat. And so, my understanding is really that, evolution from the hollow fly to the beast fly was really Bob trying to solve the problem of having a large fly that you could cast on a fly rod, right?
So the hollow fly, interestingly enough, he wasn't ever intended for size, as like length. He was trying to come up with a method because he was really curious. I think it initially kicked off when he was in Mexico and saw a guy throwing a jig where the synthetic fibers were tied forward, and as he two-hand ripped this thing back, it wasn't a fly rod, but it pulsed, right? And it got his brain thinking, like, maybe if I can tie fibers in reverse and manipulate it, I can get height to like imitate peanut bunker. The first ones he tied were probably 5 inches, I think, 4 or 5 inches. And it was all about controlling that height of it to get that broader profile by adjusting the amount of pressure you put on the fibers, right? And so he did that. That was the kind of the revolutionary hollow fly. And then it progressed. I think that's the cool thing. If you look back at all of the career, it's like one piece, a building block. Each fly kind of built upon the other, right? The Beast Fleye is composed of that extended body that he started playing with, like tying on mono extension back in the 70s, that he then put aside and played with came up with the hollow technique later on, and then the bulkhead technique. And the Beast Fleye is a composition of the bulkhead, the hollow fly body, and the extended tail off the back, right, on the mono extension. So they're all kind of like pieces that he figured out for different purposes. And then when he saw the need, kind of the opening in his, like the need for a big profiled fly, he put them together, and gave it a go. And the first one that was coined the Beast, was very successful in that he got the taper, he got the size, like the silhouette, but he just wasn't satisfied at all with the castability of it. It was so heavily, it was literally like an entire bucktail on a hook, So that's where like the iterative, so then he started playing around with, densities and kind of dialing that in, right? And depending on your fishery, like that's where you can kind of get into suiting it for your own needs. Musky guys, the whole Beast Fleye kind of platform, hollow or reverse tied platform, is used a lot in big musky flies, right? But they're probably 5 times heavier dressed than anything on the saltwater side we use, right? Because the gear's different and the require like musky trigger differently and are feeding on different prey. So figuring that out, is time on the water.
Yeah, super interesting. So, obviously, it sounds like he kind of had these almost like parts, right? And he figured out a new way to put them together to solve a problem. But, were there tires that he was interacting with or watching that had an impact on the design of the beast?
I think so. He had for years the Tuesday night tying sessions at his house. I think a lot of inspiration came from those sessions. It's like that one-on-one. He had this big round table in his tying room that would get packed with people and different tires every night. I think just that close quarters sharing of information that eventually got too big and moved out of his house. But I think all of that, like, same thing with your fishing buddies when you're out and you're like trying to crack the code on what the fish are eating and you're just kind of spitballing ideas back and forth. I think that is essentially what drove him. There weren't really a ton of people. Like Lefty had his deceiver, and then Bob came up with and Lefty named the Bucktail deceiver. But there really was, I mean, he was a pioneer as far as like a lot of these methods and patterns at the time, from the weird kind of methods that he would use from his silicones using, GE silicone from the store. He was ostracized for a year for kind of breaking the fly fishing mold, the pretentious kind of, this is how we do it. But he did it because he wanted to figure it out for himself. Like that was the end goal. It wasn't to claim he came up with a pattern that was better than everyone else. It was he wanted to figure it out for his fishery, right? And people saw the efficacy of them, right, in action, and they eventually caught on. But the Beast Fleye in particular, like in his book Fly Design, it was a total afterthought. The night before it went to publishing, they decided to take the photos in the hotel room. But Bob's like, no one's going to want to do this. It's too laborsome. And now look at how big, how popular, and how effective they are. It's kind of boomed though. But for years, he's like, no one's going to want to do this. I'm not going to put it in the book. And I'm glad they did because it's a great pattern. It's a niche pattern. It's not like you're just blind casting it everywhere, but in certain situations, it's a must,
Yeah, very, very neat. And so, tell me a little bit about the bite triggers in the beast.
So I think it's kind of the completeness of the pattern in how it's tied, right? Using bucktail. Bucktail's there's really no substitute for it. Not to say that you can't use synthetics. I think synthetics, especially for the beast, can be used to extend length in the rear. Like I think Bob used like big fly fiber for a while. Like if you can't find long bucktail, you can integrate synthetics into it. But the triggers, the beauty of it is how it breathes. So when tied sparsely enough and create like the seamless taper of the different platforms one over the next, when you strip it or by itself just in current, it pulsates, right? Because you get that head that's denser, causing that hydraulic effect and creating every one of the tips rearward to move. And it just comes alive. Like it looks like I'll go down to the river and swim, just, dangle it in the current. And I've had so many fish come up to look at it. I even got a couple on film a couple years ago. But it just comes alive. And, I think there's some part of it where, it puts off a signature similar to certain baits, just the pulsating of it. But you can also, so you don't need to do a lot and you can let it hover. Like my fishery is a little unique over, say you're fishing like a bunker school, which we have up here too, but like the herring runs, I'm fishing super fast flowing rivers with boulders and rocky ledges, and you're throwing fast sink lines and you're trying to get it down. So really you just want it to hover in that sweet zone to get ambushed, right? So whereas other instances you want to rip it through, it kind of depends on the behavior of the fish and your given situation. But getting it down to where the fish are tends to be a big one, So as far as triggers, I would say like the completeness of it as far as just how it comes alive. And you have that profile from underneath, which I think was the key Bob was thinking of when you're trying to imitate these big, shad, bunker, herring, where the fish are looking from below and, trying to ambush them. You get that perfect silhouette, right? There are things there are things you can do to your tying where you can create it, make it move more erratic, you know? Um, but by and large, it's more just a fly that comes alive when you move it rather than more like a jerk changer, let's say, right? That you're feeding on that erratic action of it to trigger, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely it does. And so, can you maybe walk us through kind of I don't know, a prototypical beast, maybe from the back to the front? And, one of the interesting things I think, since you got to spend time with Bob, would be to hear materials or techniques or things that he changed that just didn't really kind of make the final cut.
Yeah. So I mean, towards his older years, he tying on mono is, when he started out, he was tying with two vices, right? He'd have 80-pound mono strung between two vices, and you'd have to flip the spool or the bobbin over this, right? Imagine how long that would take. And so it got to the point where you're holding that mono in hand and you're spinning the bobbin around, which is how I tie most of mine. And it's much quicker. And, I think certain materials, you kind of have to trial and error whether you're mixing synthetics or just, like, depending on naturals even, but having real feathers, for instance, if they're too limp, it almost lays down over the bucktail and crushes like the profile. I think the big one for him was just going sparser and sparser and letting that bucktail breathe. So backing off and trusting the process, even though it looks kind of crazy at the vise, but keeping those fibers wide. So when you strip it, it kind of collapses down on itself and will breathe a little more. And when you go to cast it, it sheds that water quickly and is more aerodynamic because you're using such little material. But essentially you're tying bucktail in stages on this mono, typically like 1/2 inches apart. So like the first tie-in, you have a straight tie, so just like facing rearward. You can add hackles, you can add ostrich, you can the you can use all sorts of stuff. And then you switch to the reverse technique, right? And again, half inch kind of increments as you move up. And the point there is you're grabbing the bucktail from the same spot on the tail. So just by moving up the mono and creating these stages, you're essentially creating that taper. So it's not like you have to like really, he tried to make it foolproof and quick by being able to just move up. Granted, if you're mixing tones, like you do have to pay attention to that a little more, um, but I would say like building that, and as you move forward, so normally there's like seven or eight stages or reversed. So like 7 reverse ties and 1 straight off the back. And then that piece of mono with the bucktail gets latched to the hook, right? And then you build the head. So, and the head should typically be denser than the rear. And that's to really push water and make it kind of move on its own. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, it does. It's super helpful. And I mean, we talked a little bit too about how you were getting profile by the pressure, right? When you're wrapping, you want to talk a little bit about that, about how you're kind of, getting it from not being squished down to being a lot bigger. So you get that side profile on the fly.
Yeah. So there's most of the baits up here. And I realize, if you're not in the striper scene, you might not like, if you have suckers, for instance, right? They're more of a round bait, versus bunker or herring. They're very profiled. So more, broad instead of round. And so there's different techniques when you're tying the bucktail back. So part of it is kind of how you can pinch the fibers in hand as you're doing the last wraps that put pressure down on the fibers to the angle you want to create that profile. And so you can, squeeze on the sides as you do it, or squeeze like your one finger on top, 2 on the side to get like more of a triangular head. And so that's something to take into consideration. The bucktail too. I mean, and that's something before I met Bob, I didn't have Bob's book, and I had a buddy up here who was really into tying hollow flies, so he taught me kind of the basics. And when I got started, everybody's like, length. You want, the end all be all is a bucktail that's long. So I went on a tear trying to find long bucktails. And what I quickly realized is not all bucktails and not all long bucktails are created equal, and it's part of what I love about them is how the texture and the characteristics of each tail really behave just quite a bit differently when you tie flies with them. So I spent 2 years like tying with any bucktail I could get my hands on to learn, which a lot of them are a pain in the butt, right? Just because they flare but each one kind of serves its own purpose. So I tell students when I'm teaching it, like the easiest ones to manipulate when you're learning are like the soft, kind of wavy, fine fibers. But for hollow flies or big profiled flies, they're not going to really hold that profile because they're soft, right? So finding and learning, just a lot of that comes through trial and error, right? And even on the tail itself, like the base flares more, versus as you move up the tail, but no learning where to pull from on it and what type of tail to run, that's just, and I think some people get frustrated because it is complicated because there's so many variations in bucktail. To do this synthetic is much easier because you buy a package and it's the same as the previous package, right? But there's no synthetic that has a natural taper like bucktail. So
Yeah, neat. And so, to help people, and I know it's, when you say sparse, it's always interesting to me because when you see the side profile of these beasts, they almost look like a kid drew a Christmas tree, right? They're very skeletal.
yep.
But to help people, however you want to kind of help them with proportions, like, some people like talking about pencils, some people hate talking about pencils, but can you kind of give some tips as you kind of move from back to front to kind of help people, get the amount of material correct?
Yeah, I don't like pencils; they're too thick. I end up I like matchsticks because I'm a pyro. I'm just kidding. But yeah, so it depends on what bait you're trying to mimic. My big thing that I've gone back to repeatedly is functionality, right? You want it to imitate the bait, but you also want to be able to cast the thing, right? If you can't cast it out, whether you're trying to cover water around bait, then it's not serving its purpose, right? So making sure it's sparse enough that you can cast it without, tearing your rotator cuff. I end up going pretty sparse. So like on the extension, each one of the platforms that you're doing, I typically use like a matchstick worth, like not much, right? Because it's cumulative. So each one of those stages or reverse ties are going to lay over the previous, right? And then once you get to the head of it, that's where I start doubling down and increasing that mass, right? Where you want it to be. And the extension, I'll pinch a lot of times, like so that it's flat, so profiled vertically, so you get more height than width. And then the head, I don't pinch as much, almost like the three finger pinch where you're going triangle. If you look at like bunker, they're very triangular head on. Um, but building that head to push water, and a lot of the fibers in the head section overlap the rear, so it doesn't end up being as narrow as the tail section looked on its own because it fills in with the head section.
Got it. And you talked about synthetics being helpful for length. Are there times
Yep.
when you like synthetics for like maybe getting a different water flow through and around the fly?
Yeah. So I in between collars, for instance, I'll use, you can use different brushes as far as natural, like fox or marabou, to add a little, so it helps with the density, but also it helps to push more water. So you can definitely do, play around with adding different synthetics in there. What ends up happening, and you need to be a little cognizant, that I've found happens to me, is, you mix fibers in, whether even if it's flash, if you use like saltwater angel hair, for instance, versus the natural angel hair, it's more durable, but the thickness of it is like 2 to 3 times the thickness of the bucktail, and it ends up separating, right? And the same is true with synthetics, kind of trying to match the fibers density and coarseness, as well as you're trying to build this 3D profiled fly, and suddenly if you tie in synthetic material that isn't hollow that's laying on top of it, it's going to crush the work you just did previously. If so, like similarly, like the eyes, if you want to add eyes, it never makes sense to me to like glue them on and squeeze the eyes on after creating like a round or broad head. So like the tab eyes tend to be nice because they flex out, so you still get the best of both worlds in that instance. That whole eye thing is a whole nother story, but um
Fair enough. Can you maybe share with folks, obviously you're matching the hatch in a different way, but do you have some favorite kind of length kind of material and hook combinations you can share with folks for different forage species that might be helpful?
yeah. Well, I mean, even same forage species, like depending on where you're fishing them. So, Bob's hands, and what he encouraged like new tires to try tying the beast rather than on a mono extension, to use like chocolate shanks. Um, but they're easier to tie, but they also do a great job at adding some weight to get the fly down. So if you're fishing fast current rips, and herring are getting pushed out of the river, for instance, and you want to get down, sure, you're throwing it on a fast sink line and a shorter leader, but the fly itself has, you know, neutrally buoyant bucktail and stuff on it, which the line will pull down, but it oftentimes, having the shanked version, will get down quicker, right? Which means you're in that strike zone longer a lot of times. So kind of weighing that option too, as you're, depending where you're fishing, having a different tool in your toolbox, right? Um, so I keep that in mind. And then, sometimes, like, I had one really interesting learning experience when I was down on the Cape last month. Um, I've never had issues of short strikes fishing for stripers with beast flies. I've never experienced that. But when I was down on the Cape, we had this incredible kind of Hoagie Menhaden feed going on in super shallow water. Big stripers up to like 50 pounds were pushing the bait up on the beaches and rocks. They were killing themselves to not get eaten, right? And I was throwing beast flies at them. And I think because they were in such shallow water and such kind of high stake kind of situation, they kept T-boning them. So I kept hooking these monster fish, and they'd rip line, like 3 or 4 feet of line out of my hand, and then it'd come unbuttoned. Because what they were doing was they were stunning the bait, right? They weren't just inhaling them, which I've always experienced. Normally they come up and just inhale the fly, these big fish, right? Whereas in this situation, they were literally just hitting them as hard as they could. So the version that I've tied in the past, where you have a shank or two in front and then a hook kind of off the rear, that would have fixed it. I did not have any on hand, so that was a learning experience to throw one in the box next time.
Yeah, very, very neat. Are there any other, the Beast Fly was around, it'd been around for a while. Like some of the other streamers we've talked about on the Butcher Shop, are there other refinements that Bob made over his lifetime you want to share with folks?
Well, I think, the progression, the initial like bunker on mono attempt that he did back in the 70s, then sat until I think the early 2000s or 20, somewhere around then, when the beast kind of came to be. But he was developing extended body squid flies and extended body deceivers and, big hollow flies. And it was that progression of putting all of these tools that he was learning about natural materials together to accomplish the goal, right, that he was after. I think there's still room to keep pushing this depending on your fishery. That's one thing I love about like visiting different fisheries up and down the coast and just seeing, whether you're fishing boulder fields or you're fishing rivers or you're fishing, deep drop offs, like you can adjust your pattern, you can adjust the even the materials you're using to get it down quicker. You can add weight, you can, change it so that you can cast it further on a lighter rod. Like it's all tweakable, and it just requires time and testing and trying stuff out, right? And I think all the foundational elements are Bob has shared gracefully with all of us in fly design, and yeah, my ADD and lack of sleep kicked in, so I don't remember what you asked. So
No, it's all good. I think we kind of got it. And,
okay.
Yeah, it's all good. And no, it's kind of funny, for folks that have listened to some of the butcher shops, had a similar thing with Tommy Lynch, and I told him it was okay to repack a Zen and some more Copenhagen. So, I think I even told him I think he maybe had a Monster. Yeah, it was a Monster. It wasn't Mountain Dew, but yeah, it's dude, it's all good. And, I've been up early, but I haven't been up since 3-something this morning. So, you're totally cool. When you teach the pattern, what are some common mistakes that you see tyers make that you can kind of, give them some advice and help them have a less frustrating time as they kind of learn to fly?
Yeah. I think choosing the right bucktail and then doing it like, don't jump into tying a monster, trying to tie a big monster beast, right? Break it down so that you're tying, like, learn to tie a hollow fly, learn to tie a bulkhead fly, learn to tie a 3D deceiver or a 3D bunker, where all of the principles are that he kind of came up with were to build bulk and taper into these patterns. And by learning those skills, you can kind of pick and choose depending what you're trying to achieve as far as your profile, right? So once you master the hollow technique, right, then maybe grab some shanks and try tying a beast on that first, right? And when you think you have sparse enough material to tie down, half it, and go super sparse. It adds up with the different steps, but kind of learn those foundation skills before trying to jump into it. I think that's where the frustration comes, is like trying to learn to tie on mono in hand. Yeah, it takes a ton of practice, right? And it's frustrating if you've never done a hollow tie before, right? But if you master those skills first, then it's like, okay, now I can add one more skill to it, right? Make it a little more complex because it saves time that way, right? But kind of be patient and put those reps in.
Got it. And so, obviously this, one of the secret sauces is the deer hair. And,
Yep.
so, don't burn your personal source, but are there places that people can go to where they're going to have a chance of, cause you can't always, handle, natural stuff before you buy it, or some places you can suggest people go to buy, bucktails, to, say, hey, there you go, call and say, hey, I'm tying Beast Flies, and they're like, dude, we know exactly what you need, or something close to what you need, and they send it to you?
Yeah, I mean, there's no substitute for handling them and feeling them before buying them. So, I check out all the local shops and even big box stores, and, every once in a while you find a golden one. But for those that don't have access to that, there's a couple other sources on through social media that they're tires and kind of know what you're looking for. So Brad Buzzy is a great one. He's at all the fly fishing shows. Ellis Ward, he's got he ties a lot of he's a talented tire and knows his stuff. So if you contact him, Midwest Bucktails, they're another good one. But yeah, I feel like in the Northeast, we're using, well, I guess the Midwest with the whole musky scene too. There's a lot of knowledgeable people. So check in with your local shop too. But yeah, it's hard. I try not to buy blind unless like I know that the person that you're getting it from ties flies and kind of knows what you're going for, because I've lost a lot of money where you're like being promised something nice and you get it and you're like, I could have gotten that for half the price down the road. So
Yeah, we don't want to do that, do we?
no, I mean, it's always a gamble, right? Because it's natural material, but yeah, try to stick with people that actually tie. It's such a helpful, because if you're dealing with a tire and not just a processor, you're able to explain what your plan is for it, and they can kind of educate and pick good ones for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we talked before we started recording. I think we may have even done this by text or email, that kind of some of your contribution to the Beast Fleye is that, you people don't understand how much you have to tweak it for what you're fishing for where you are. Right. And we've kind of talked about that kind of obliquely kind of throughout the interview, but do you want to kind of sum that up for people and kind of give them a feel for what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes across the board as far as fly tying, right? You can read a recipe in a book, and Bob did a beautiful job laying out how to tie this. But until you fish it, right, in whatever situation you're in, I mean, if I were going down to Island Beach State Park and I followed his instructions, um, chances are, sure, it'll fish, but like there's just nuances that you figure out by putting time at the vise, right? And one thing, like Bob's first attempt, the reason it was called the Beast is because it was so big and just tough, but it accomplished something, right? Each one of the flies you tie should accomplish something, right? It might not have been effective for what you were going after, but you learned, I need to go sparser next time. I need to get it deeper. I need, to make it lighter so that it casts better. I need to change the hook, right? I need to go with a heavier gauge hook to keel properly in this current, or I need to go with a lighter one so that, I'm hovering in said stage, or, like those are all things that reading the book isn't going to necessarily tell you, right? Because the fishery varies so greatly. Bob was fishing these, you know, most often off of on the beach, right? On Island Beach State Park. Like, I don't fish them anywhere on a beach. Like, I'm fishing, around deeper water schools of pogies or in rivers where it's deep and fast current, right? And I need to be able to cast it with an 9 or 10 weight repeatedly, 80 to 90 feet, right? And if you tie it too heavy, you're not going to be able to achieve those. And by testing and tweaking and watching it swim and watching how the fish react to it, you're able to modify how you tie it. And eventually those kind of understandings become ingrained in your brain, right? All those lessons learned, repetitive, to the point where I'm pretty confident I can tie a fly to get what I want it to do. Um, but yeah, it's just fish. Like, you know, sure, fly tying is an art form, but Bob would be the first to say the reason we're tying is to be effective at catching fish, right? Pretty doesn't catch fish, right? And I always thought it was funny because I do like the kind of realism side of things, which is great. And I don't think it hurts a lot of times. But, as far as like eyes, most of the flies I fish, I don't have eyes, but I'll throw them on, or they'll start out with eyes. But anyways, it's one of those things. Put the time in on the water to figure it out.
Got it. And, I'm trying to kind of think through kind of an easy way to kind of set up the next series of questions. Obviously you're fishing, stripers, but in a lot of different situations. Can you kind of talk us through kind of use cases in terms of like, like you talked earlier about like, well, I'm in the rivers, I'm trying to hang them, right?
Yep.
Versus, fishing them on a rip on a jetty or something like that. Can you kind of maybe talk about, here are some situations and this is where I'm trying to fish the beast and this is my tackle setup and this is how I'm presenting the fly?
Sure. I mean, most of the time I'm throwing a 10 weight with a fast sink, like 400 grain head. Like the new striper line SA came out with has been super good. It's the S357. And so that line, they increase the diameter of the running line so it doesn't tangle as much, which I think is awesome. But that line, getting it down so often, like the fish are down low unless they're like pushing bait up. So getting down to them can be critical. So typically I'm throwing a fast sink and, I'll either go like 3 feet of 40 pound to, 2 feet of 25 pound, or depending what's there. If I'm snagging, like if there's a lot of snags, I'll either do the Russian roulette and go heavy and hope I don't snag and then break my fly line, or have a or go with 20 and then break my tippet and lose the fly. So but just gauging that. Although like last season I caught my PB striper on foot off the rocky ledges up here, um throwing a 10 weight with a floating line and like 7.5 foot kind of stout leader and a Beast Fleye. And that was, you had like this cross current cutting across this submerged island, and the fish were getting pushed in because there was a current set up. So I was throwing this float, and I mean, I always try to picture the bait because I've swam and observed the fish underwater too, and watched how they behave from my polling platform so much, but watch how they move into certain spots. And so the current gets so strong up here that baits just don't stand a chance. So they're getting swept across, and the fish will set up right kind of in the pocket below where it dumps off from that submerged island. So I was pretty kind of swinging it through, letting it kind of breathe almost. And then, occasionally doing a couple longer strips just to kind of get it to pulse and kind of, I think the stop and go is a big one I've found over the years, where letting your fly pause and move. Sometimes if stripers are around or if predator fish are around, it catches their attention more than just a steady retrieve. But yeah, those two setups, he sometimes on an intermediate, but I end up either fast sink or intermediate, or float, like the float setup I was telling you.
Very, very neat. And, before we go tonight, I know you're one of the keepers of Bob's Flame, or there's some other people out there kind of tying in his style flies that you watch, or you want to kind of, let folks know are out there kind of building on Bob's tradition as well.
I mean, one person that I've been inspired by, and honestly, that sparked my curiosity and really I look up to still is Jason Taylor and his amazing skills with ostrich and bucktail, and he does some really innovative, cool stuff. And it's neat. He's down in Philly, but he fishes Jersey, and so it's neat to bounce ideas off of him from his fishery too. But he's a big one. I mean, there's so many tires out there now working on this stuff, and some really talented ones.
Yeah, I know Jason was on Masters of the Fly, I think this past season, right?
Yep. Yeah, he's super talented. He tied a couple Beast Flies palmering ostrich. So he like splits the ostrich in half, the ostrich plume in half, and then he'll wrap it up the mono. So you get this cool kind of filler tail. It's kind of neat.
Yeah, super neat. Anybody else you can think of?
There's I don't know how to say his last name, Andrew Warshar. He's been at it for a long time. Out of the gate, he shared quite a bit of tips and techniques with me, which was super helpful. He spent a lot of time with Bob learning, so that he's always one of the top guys. Trying to think who else. Not to say they aren't out there. I'm just brain dead.
No, it's all good. I'll give you a break. You've been up since 3-something in the morning. We got a couple names. If you think of anybody else, text me on, and I'll drop a link to like their Instagram page or something in there.
Yeah.
But the good news is, right, so the Beast is an involved tie. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, Bob was like, let's not even put it in the book because no one wants to do this. But if you prefer to buy versus tie, you want to let folks know a little bit about the fly drops you do throughout the year?
Yeah, so during my off season, during my guiding season, pretty much from mid-May to mid-October, give or take a couple weeks on either end, I'm not tying for my fly drops, but my fly drops are kind of small batch releases of flies that I do through my website. So if people are interested, you can check out benwhalleyfishing.com. Check out the fly drops page, and you become a member. It's free, but it will get you signed up for the email to find out when the fly drops go live, and access to the fly shop where those flies will populate on noon of whatever date that the fly drop is happening. And then it's kind of first come, first serve to get them. And I try to, include a good variety of, big flies, bit like Beast Flies, some other patterns I've been playing around with, and then hollow flies and kind of the staples that are kind of the day in, day out catchers along the East Coast, especially as far as patterns go, bulkheads, hollows. So yeah, if interested, head over there, sign up, and I will let everybody know when the next one is. Once the season starts wrapping up.
Yeah. So I will drop a link to that in the show notes. Ben, before I let you go tonight, is there anything else you'd like to share with our listeners?
No, I mean, I just fish and share your knowledge with everybody. We're all in this together, trying to do this, follow our passions. And I just think it's great. The more, the merrier, as far as getting into the sport. So,
yeah, very, very cool. And what's the best way for folks to get in touch and follow your adventures at the Vice and on the water?
probably Instagram, benwhalleyfishing.com. Any questions, tying related, or if interested in getting out, shoot me a DM, or if charter wise, you can submit a request through the website too.
Very cool. And I will drop links to all that stuff in the show notes. Well, Ben, I super appreciate you spending time with me after getting up very, very early and spending all day on the water. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. It's always good to catch up. Glad to hear things are going well. Thanks for having me on here.
Oh, dude, it's been super cool. And, gosh, I don't know. I guess maybe we'll bump into each other at Bobbin again, or maybe sometime before then.
Yes, hopefully.
Well, listen, take care.
Thanks, you too.
Well, folks, we hope you enjoyed the interview as much as we enjoyed bringing it to you. Before we leave you, one more thing. If you listen to the podcast, you know about trout routes. If you fish Midwest lakes, you owe it to yourself to check out its sister app, onX Fish Midwest. onX Fish takes the guesswork out of finding new places to fish. Search and filter lakes by species, size, and abundance, plus get local details and background info so you can show up with a plan A and as many backup plans as you want. Make the most of your time on the water. Head over to onxmaps.com today. And remember, folks, links to all of this episode's sponsors are in the show notes. Check them out. Fish hard, folks.